I don't like forced socialization in MMOs, and neither should you. This is MultimediaJay Radio Style for Wednesday, March 20th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay Radio Style.
Well, folks, it happened again. Once again, I have left a free company in Final Fantasy XIV because of abusive individuals starting drama. This has become rather unique to this game because I've been in guilds in Final Fantasy XIV, Elder Scrolls Online, Guild Wars 2, and World of Warcraft, and I have only had this specific problem in this specific game. Previously, I wrote some blog entries that mentioned that it seemed like Final Fantasy XIV had some issues with not giving players enough tools to deal with toxic individuals and things like dungeon runs and whatnot. I'm starting to wonder if I'm running into these kinds of problems again years later, specifically with this game more than any other MMO type game that I've been playing recently. Is this something that is inherent to the Final Fantasy player base, that I keep running into people who, through their behavior, send me a very clear message that I don't want to be in a social group in one of these games with people who act the way that they act? It's the same behaviors over and over again. You got people who either make my experience miserable directly, or they indirectly make my experience miserable by treating others like crap. They don't take responsibility for their words and actions. They don't respect other people's time when we go into PvE content, and they can't be bothered to learn the fights, stick to the mechanics, own their mistakes if a party leader calls them out for doing something wrong in a boss fight. And all this blame-shifting, gaslighting, abusive nonsense that I have had to deal with enough times in the offline world in the past couple of years. Never mind coming onto video games to, have some fun, a little bit of escapism from life's problems, only to encounter the exact same crap among players in this game that I encounter in the offline world. In the worst case, a drama-causing individual caused drama. I didn't feel like putting up with it. I leave the free company and blacklist the individual, and later on, just to see if I was right about the whole mess in the first place, I cross-reference my blacklist to the character profiles on the lodestone and find out that this character not only left the free company, but left the whole server. I would just rather not deal with any of this nonsense because I just want to log into a video game and have some fun. But this does speak to the whole issue with forced socialization in MMOs. It's an issue that I think I'm on the minority opinion side of, because I actually believe that making socialization optional in an MMO isn't a bad thing. And I'm very curious about the upcoming Tokyo Fan Fest, where more details about the Shadowbringers expansion should be discussed. I'm very curious as to what's going to be discussed. But more than anything else, I want to know what exactly Square Enix is doing with the trust system. It's one of the big reasons why I came back to the game to check it out and play through all the previous content, after all. And I've become a big fan of squadron missions for leveling alt jobs and things along those lines. For those of you that don't know what that is, you can make a squadron of NPCs that you can raid certain dungeons with in this game. By the way, folks, I'm coming back to Final Fantasy from years of Western RPGs. If I use the Western RPG terms for things like guilds and dungeons and outdoor events, as opposed to Square Enix's, oh yeah, we're going to be clever and make up new words for the same old stuff. Things like guild leaves, guild hests, fates, free companies. If I tend to mix up the terms more or use the Western RPG terms more, it's where I came from. Come on now. But anyways, it doesn't seem to be a popular idea that making socialization optional in an MMO can be anything good. If anything, what I keep hearing is, not only is it a bad thing, but it destroyed World of Warcraft. WoW Classic is going to be better because you'll actually have to work with other players and make friends and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I do not share that opinion whatsoever. I'm very curious as to what Square Enix is going to do with the trust system, but we'll wait and see on that one. You see, not only do I think that forced socialization is an MMO failure, and it is gonna be, in the long run, a net negative for the genre, But I don't even think that forced socialization should be part of the definition of MMOs, and that massively multiplayer online role-playing games does not need to mean that you're going to be forced to potentially have a miserable experience with players that you otherwise wouldn't play the game with. Let's take Dungeon Finder, for example, or, as Final Fantasy so cleverly calls it, the duty roulette. Final Fantasy, now that I think of it, doesn't have the same kind of pug buffs that World of Warcraft does with Dungeon Finder groups. So, literally, it's just a matchmaking system. The one wild card is Trials, where the Echo will revive your group and boost your stats if you wipe too many times on a boss fight. But that's intrinsic to Trials themselves and not necessarily part of the matchmaking system. It's one of those little details that I haven't been paying attention to because I got so used to the Dungeon Finder buff in WoW that I stopped really thinking about it. And, of course, groups, despite the hand-holding, would still find ways to not be good at the content. But the interesting thing with Final Fantasy is that, despite the lack of hand-holding, I've actually encountered situations where puggers are actually a better experience than running dungeons with guildies. Wrap your head around that one. It's like, why? If Dungeon Finder is so terrible, how come I can get into random groups that do a better job of downing bosses and completing dungeons than actual folks that are supposed to provide a better experience than the puggers? This is actually my challenge to the free companies in this game, is what's the point of someone joining and staying in your free company if the experience is not going to be better than if they were just pugging it on their own? I think that's something that the guild leadership, as it would be called in Western MMOs or Western RPGs, has to really think about in terms of the experience of what it's like to be on their team. But all challenges aside, let's think about why this forced socialization thing just doesn't hold any water. Let's think about MMOs versus the RPGs they evolved out of. Massively multiplayer online role-playing game. What part of that definition suggests that it should be compulsory in the limited free time that we all have to play a game with individuals we'd rather not play a game with in order to progress through the content? It's nowhere. It's actually a leftover, holdover type thingy from World of Warcraft's dominance and early MMOs' dominance when nothing better had been invented and there was literally nothing else anybody could do. Some of it was game design, like the overemphasis on raids as endgame content, but the industry has been trying to move away from that. Not just WoW, but other games as well have tried to do other things to provide compelling experiences besides racing into the raids if you play XYZ game. But game design inertia doesn't get away from the fact that, as a concept, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game is just a regular online role-playing game, but bigger. Instead of, say, like a Neverwinter Nights persistent world server with a maximum of 32 to 40 players at once, you have data centers running worlds with thousands of people. I don't think that forced socialization is what makes MMOs feel alive and worthwhile. It's good experiences. And some of the developments in some other MMOs in recent years, like Star Wars with its big stories, Guild Wars 2 with Living World, ESO with its stories and expansion packs, and especially Final Fantasy with the main story quest, and how cinematic that gets, and how it starts feeling like an offline Final Fantasy game if you stick to just that content. I think that the industry has noted this and has moved on from the old model where forced socialization was the only way that these games can feel alive. I mean, let's think about it. If you have a bunch of people mining in the mines, crafting gear, prettying up player houses, things like that, stuff that's not related to things like raid progression, is that better than a game that's just AI? Yes. If you have people making up their own fun in the town square, like Final Fantasy players do in Limsa Laminza around the Aetheryte, the teleport stone thing, for those of you who don't play the game, it's kind of like a town square, center of town type place. But you might see people dancing, you might see bards playing instruments, you might see folks dressing up in weird costumes, doing all kinds of other bizarre things that don't progress anyone through the game, but they definitely make for a fun experience. Even if you're just watching other people goof off in the middle of town, not really doing much except for goofing around with emotes and stuff like that. And if you can make some friends and meet some folks that you like running dungeons with or doing game events with or something other than pugging, that's cool. But you know where all the negative stuff comes from? You know where all the drama comes from? You know where all the bad stuff that I hear people complain about MMOs comes from again and again and again and again? Forced socialization. That person that had to join the guild because if we didn't let them join, we wouldn't have a tank or a healer or something else. Or those people in the pug that just screwed around and had no interest whatsoever in doing the fight correctly. And you spent 3 hours in a dungeon instead of 1 hour and feel like you wasted way too much time because of some idiot in your pug, blah, 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 blah. The list goes on and on. And then let's not even get into the unfortunate issue that happened today where not only did I leave the free company, but somebody else left several hours before I chose to. The rest of the story with me leaving this free company is that one of the guild officers, very talkative in blue chat, swung in a more malicious direction with a discussion about tanks, healers, and DPS, aka the MMO Trinity, and really ran afoul of anybody who has ever had a bad experience in an MMO with bad players. Now, this company that I left is one of the longest running companies on the server, so there's a very good chance that this little princess of a guild officer was very pampered and hasn't had to do much pugging a lot in recent years because of being at a 45-degree angle nonetheless in a free company and able to run dungeons with lots of people that aren't random strangers that she'll never see again. The big thing is she wasn't talking about giving DPS any real accountability. They're very, very soft on DPS. But like, oh, tanking and healing, it's a lot more to worry about. Yeah, it's a lot more to worry about with tanking and healing because those are the two roles in the MMO Trinity where somebody else can do something wrong and you either look incompetent or you have a hard time or you get stressed out because of the actions of somebody else. If you're the tank and one of the DPS or somebody thinks you're too slow and they pull extra mobs and try and get you to pick them up because otherwise you're not doing your job as a tank, well, or what about healers? What about healers getting blamed? A phenomenon that I've been very familiar with in World of Warcraft over the years that I've recently learned has spread to Overwatch now. Apparently it's a thing in Overwatch for people to blame the healers for everything that goes wrong in a match. Okay, so this nonsense has spread to that game now too. And we wonder why people don't want to tank or heal and why Dungeon Finder queues are what they are and have been that way now for over 10 years. Yeah, I remember Wrath of the Lich King and the hour-long queues for DPS because there were always way more people that wanted to play DPS instead of tank or healer. Over a decade later, Final Fantasy XIV, same problem. I still hear people complain about queues, and I still hear people complain about how people don't want to tank and heal. And then I run into situations like Prissy over here, where their attitude is rubber stamping the kind of treating people like crap that has led to people not wanting to tank or heal. This is why I really don't care about whatever specifics come up at the Tokyo Fan Fest about the Gunbreaker, the new tank class that's going to be coming out in Shadowbringers. Because I know that adding another tank class is not going to solve the game's tank shortage. World of Warcraft's tank shortage wasn't solved when Death Knights were added, or Brewmasters. Gunbreaker won't be any more successful. How do I know this? Because you can't design away people's bad attitudes. People have to choose to change their attitudes or the problem is never going to go away. It's that simple. If people don't want the tank to call the shots in terms of what mobs get pulled when, or they scream that you're too slow because the tank doesn't want to stress out the healer for the duration of the match. Oh, another thing too, by the way, that leads to people not wanting to tank or heal. If that's going on, then who's going to want to tank? Or what about healers getting blamed for things other people are doing wrong, like standing in AE or something else or something to that effect? Something that's been going on for a very long time and now has expanded beyond the MMO world. I'll even go so far as to say that I don't believe healers should even exist. I think they are an artificial construct that was propped up by World of Warcraft's game design in its earlier days. But that's another discussion entirely. But again, forced socialization. If you can run everything with friends, you don't have to worry about Joe Random pulling aggro or whatever and making people not want to tank or heal. But with this crap that's been going on now for decades at this point, we still have a situation where DPS queues are forever compared to tanks and healers. And you also have the inverse problem as well, where DPS get sick of waiting a long time for dungeon queues and they start playing tanks and healers, and they aren't very good at either of those two roles because they're not really interested in tanking or healing. They just want a shorter dungeon queue so they can do their roulettes. So the reverse problem happens as well. But underneath all of this is bad attitudes. And these bad attitudes come to the surface because of forced socialization. If you can make some friends and run dungeons and raids with them and live happily ever after, that's awesome. But you should not have to put up with nonsense from others in order to play these games. And I think that's the design flaw that is holding the genre back. Now, we've already seen an online RPG go very far in the other direction when it comes to making socialization optional. And it wasn't World of Warcraft Warlords of Draenor with the garrisons, by the way. It was the original Guild Wars. Besides the henchmen with their questionable AI, there were hero characters that were more directly controllable in terms of you could set their behaviors, call spells on demand, things along those lines. But also towards the very end of the run of the original Guild Wars, there were heroes that you could make based on your alts and based on whatever characters, whatever you wanted. I basically turned my alts into hero characters, so no matter which character I was logged on as, I would always have an AI-powered version of the other ones as characters in the party. But that's the thing, too. You could also augment groups with AI as well, so you didn't need to wait for a healer forever or hope that you didn't get some idiot tank that didn't know how to tank. You just have a tank NPC, and depending on how well the AI was programmed, you might have to issue a few commands here and there, but it would be better than dealing with a terrible tank. I mean, these kinds of things did exist before. Socialization was pretty optional when Guild Wars 1 finished up its run, so to speak, and now it's kind of a maintenance mode type game, and there's a couple of things getting added here and there, but at the end of the heyday of the original Guild Wars, before Guild Wars 2 came out, socialization was completely optional. Now, maybe Guild Wars went too far in the other direction, but I would not have a problem with being able to take a break from having to run content with people who were an absolute coin toss as to whether it would be a good run and things along those lines. And so I'm a big fan of the squadron feature in Final Fantasy XIV. It requires a little bit of extra thinking and issuing some extra commands from a hotbar for engage, disengage, etc. to deal with boss mechanics. But so far I've cleared up to Brayflox's long stop hard mode, including the highly technical bomb mobile boss at the end, with AI. And I would much rather have the challenge of a puzzle to figure out as opposed to the harassment of somebody who had some kid who had like a bad day at school and was playing badly and was whining in the chat about how everyone else sucked as they got blown up by an AE spell or a tank buster when they weren't even a tank. Ask any Final Fantasy player what a tank buster is if you don't. Well, no, just kidding. The bosses all have super attacks that tanks are supposed to use cooldowns to mitigate. Otherwise, they'll get either severely injured or one-shot. It's one of the ways to keep things interesting and keep tanks on their toes. But to bring everything full circle, when I see the arguments about forced socialization in MMOs and whether or not forced socialization is what really makes these game worlds feel alive, I have to ask, how much drama have these MMO players making these arguments been through specifically because of forced socialization? That person who otherwise shouldn't be in the guild, but they're in there because they have to be, or, you know, those people I didn't want to run the dungeon with, but I had to run the dungeon with in order to get my daily roulette reward, and things like that. You know, the offline world has enough examples of where we think life isn't fair because we're being punished because of someone else's mistakes. We don't need this in our video games either. There's nothing wrong with socialization in an MMO. It's the forced variety that causes all the drama. And that is what game design needs to take very clear aim at in terms of eliminating, so that this genre can finally move forward. Thanks for listening, everybody. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.